Good evening and welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Most of us are visitors on this land, and this acknowledgement is a critical place to locate today's talk about land use, specifically the Treaty 8 region of northeastern BC, which is home to the Dane-zaa peoples. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I'm the director of SFU Galleries, and I'm very pleased to be introducing Hugh Brody this evening and his talk on maps and dreams. The context for this talk is the exhibition that is currently at the Audain gallery downstairs, and I hope you had a chance to drop in on your way up here. And it's on until the end of the month, from which my co-curator, the artist Brian Youngin, and I borrowed Hugh Brody's book title, so thank you for that. Unfortunately, Brian couldn't be here with us this evening, and while I'm not going to speak for him at all, I'll try and represent our curatorial perspective. Through the work of 8 artists, the exhibition includes Askoty, Brittney and Richelle, Jennifer Bowes, Brenda Draney, Emilie Mattson, Karl Mattson, Garry Oker, and Peter von Tiesenhausen. Their works represent Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives, and the exhibition explores conceptions and implications of land use on the territory of the Dane-zaa people, now in Treaty 8. And some of the artists connect directly to Hugh Brody's book, such as Askoty, whose large archive of photographs is shown in a small selection in the gallery downstairs. He was consulted as a mapper and a field worker, as I understand it, for Brody's study, and also figures on at least one of the edition's covers. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with Treaty 8, it is the size of France. It's a very large area and comprises northeastern BC, northern Alberta, southwest Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories, and of course includes Fort McMurray and the tar sands, the W.A.C. Bennett Dam, the site of Site C, and clearly oil and gas is one of the largest economic drivers in the region, or is the largest. So in borrowing the title from Brody's book, Maps and Dreams, which is, as you undoubtedly know because you're here, a 1981 anthropological study of the Dane-zaa, this exhibition downstairs looks at how this land and its intersection with human use is articulated, represented, and contested through works which map territory and connections in specific ways and take up material, conceptual, and nuanced positions that try to thwart essentialist readings of the land. Hugh Brody's book was and is very important to Brian Youngin in connecting with his own history and culture. And it was Brian who proposed borrowing the title and framing the exhibition via Maps and Dreams. And in particular, he really was very interested in the clever accordion-like structure of the chapters, which alternates between first-person accounts by the author and more objective reports of social, environmental, and historical contexts as a structuring device for the exhibition. So our use of the title is an echo. And in his preface to Maps and Dreams, Brody writes that there is a prospect in northern BC for a replay of injustice, ruthlessness, and indifference to human well-being that is all too familiar in the history of white dealings with Indians in the lands of the New World. Dreams collide, new kinds of maps are made. And this continues, of course, to be true today. We have invited Hugh Brody to speak to his book tonight in the context of the exhibition and to undertake a little bit of stock-taking from 1981 to the present. Considering the ways in which the history of farming invades and transforms regions, his book sees an earlier stage of resource extraction and the mounting pressures of communities in the Treaty 8 region. Given the cycles of industry in the region, and of course we've seen several booms of oil and gas since 1981, and the heated debates about other large projects such as Site C, we're interested in your current thinking on the region. Some of the cycles of tension between traditional hunting, trapping, agriculture, and oil and gas were approached in a public conversation that I think a few of you attended at the opening of the exhibition on May 31st. And with the artists, we undertook a bit of a discussion around some of these tensions from their perspectives. And I would just also like to note that there's another public event in relationship to the exhibition, which will take place on Saturday, July 15th. It's a reading group with Kate Hennessy, professor of SFU's School of Interactive Arts and Technology, the director of Making Culture Lab, and also a member of Ethnographic Terminalia Curatorial Collective. And in the reading group, she will lead a reading and listening event that requires no preparation on the subject of Dane-zaa dream maps through oral and written texts, including Maps and Dreams. And I just have to hold up my early edition copy, which has this wonderful picture of Hugh on the back. And now to Hugh Brody. So Hugh Brody is a British anthropologist, filmmaker, social philosopher, and of course the author of Maps and Dreams, amongst numerous other titles. Brody's continued work around Indigenous and settler communities considers how the modern treaty process unfolds. He has been an important advocate in the field of Indigenous land use and rights, of which Maps and Dreams is only one project. He is the author of The People's Land, 1975, one of the first close-up looks at how Inuit life and lands have been colonized by Southerners, and The Other Side of Eden, Hunters, Farmers, and the Shaping of the World, written in 2000. He has made many films with many First Nations and Indigenous communities, and co-directed the NFB film Treaty 8 Country in 1981, which we'll get to see a little bit of tonight. He has taught widely and currently holds a Canada Research Chair at the University of the Fraser Valley, which is why he's here with us tonight, and very gratefully so, which brings him back to, of course, this region this summer from London, where he lives. We will have time for questions following the talk, and please wait for a microphone as we're recording tonight's talk. And I would like to just thank you, finally, the SFU Department of Sociology and Anthropology for co-presenting this talk, and to the Canada Council and BC Arts Council for their support. So please join me in welcoming Hugh Brody.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you very much for being here. I also would like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and it's an honor to be on that territory, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here at SFU, and it's daunting to be at a place and at a moment and at a set of thoughts where art meets anthropology. I suppose there are all kinds of overlaps between art and anthropology, and I want to explore some of those tonight by looking at the whole idea of invisibility. Artists seek to make the invisible visible, and so do anthropologists, at least the kind of anthropologists I believe in do. And I want to make a journey back into northeast BC, into the world of the Dane-zaa, along their trails and into their thoughts. And I'd like to begin by showing you just a few minutes from a film that I made in 1981 on the reserve where I was living at a moose hunting camp, the autumn dry meat hunting camp, part of the seasonal round of the Dane-zaa, out deep in the woods of northeast British Columbia, deep in the territory of one group of Dane-zaa. The film was shot in a sort of amateurish way, I have to say. It's not terrifically great quality. It's an old 16mm print that was transferred and then copied into a DVD, so it's a slightly worn look, but it will take you to the world of the Dane-zaa for a few minutes. So let's look at that.
まず칼 하나.
Blood.
Brigham.
This line.
Warline. Ginger.
Renters, are you tired of paying rent every month to a landlord on his property, or of having very little privacy between you and other occupants of the building? If so, come and talk to Peace River Mortgages today. We can show you how you can buy your own home with often as little as 10% down. Let your next-door neighbor make your dream home into a reality. Call us 785-4451.
Your next-door neighbor, get to know us.
It's message time on NL Radio 560 CKNL Fort St. John and 590 CFNL Fort Nelson.
First message going out at 12:04 to Bud Napoleon in the Fort St. John area. Please try to be available with any means of transportation for the upcoming workshop. There are not enough vehicles for people interested in going. That's from Amy Goche. To all Fort St. John Indian bands, Tuesday and Wednesday is the Treaty 8 workshop and the Indian Days powwow at the halfway. Food will be provided. Please bring camping gear and drums and absolutely no alcohol. From Chief Brittney Matachi.
Of the Dane-zaa in northeast British Columbia, in their forests at their hunting camp. Every year they had a dry meat camp, about 15 people living there for several weeks. When I was there filming that particular scene, that particular sequence, they killed 13 moose in the 2-week period, provided huge amounts of dry meat, and lived a life of calm, uncluttered, wonderful happiness. It's not a romanticism to say that people were well. It's not a romanticism to say that they were healthy. They were living their life, and they were living it in their way, and they were living it when they were in the forests, when they were at those kind of camps. They were living it well. I first was asked to go to northeast British Columbia in 1977, and I first went there in 78. This was a job with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs as a researcher as part of a project that I'll say a bit about later. But I want to say that when I was first asked to go there, I was very, very reluctant. Everything I'd heard about northeast British Columbia, especially the Fort St. John area, made me think this was a place to avoid. Every stereotype that converges on First Nations, every derogatory way in which they are represented in the media, in public discourse, even in anthropology, every negative stereotype was at work in relation to the people of northeast British Columbia. They were considered to be a bunch of drunks hanging out at the bars of Fort St. John. They were not on their land. They were poor. The contemporary documents, including those written by people close to them, Indian agents, missionaries, the contemporary documents again and again characterize them as indigent, wretched, poorly clad, destitute, and in need only of the kind of help that southern Canada was able to bring to them: relief, Christianity, settlement, modernity, civilization. That was the prevailing stereotype. And this was a stereotype reinforced, what's more, by the scholarship of the day. The great Hawthorne report, produced from the University of British Columbia in 1968, I believe, characterized the Indians of that region, as it did of many regions, as poor and unemployed. These are the unemployed who worked full-time as hunters and trappers. These were the unemployed who spent their lives on the land, living their life. But in the mind of the social science of the day, they were poor and unemployed. And the implication of their poverty, of course, was that they were hungry and suffering all kinds of stress and distress. And these were people, as we were to learn when we did the work, on average had 1.5 pounds of meat per day per person coming into the communities. 1.5 pounds of meat per day per person coming into the communities. These were the people who were sort of somehow destitute and wretched. This stereotype was one of the ways in which the First Nations of British Columbia, northeast British Columbia, were disappeared by the colonial project, disappeared by the voices of history, disappeared by everyone except themselves, of course. But they had also been forced out of their lands by the colonial frontier. The agricultural settlement along the Peace River Valley, the arrival of ranchers, the oil and gas industry, the town of Fort St. John itself, had driven people out of their original territories, out of some of their very best lands. To some extent, therefore, they had, as it were, disappeared from places that had been heartlands, disappeared from places that had been very much at the center of their cultures and economic lives. They had been forced away, but they'd been forced away into a deeper retreat, as it were, a deeper journey into their huge hunting and gathering territories. Now, there's another way that they were invisible, since the theme, I think, of what I'm going to talk about this evening is invisibility. Another way in which they were invisible came from their culture itself. They didn't build monuments. They didn't build roads. They didn't build permanent houses. They left nothing behind when they moved on. Theirs is the ultimately recyclable economy. Everything they made and produced could be left there and would quietly disappear back into the ground. So if you went into their territories looking for them, you would only find it hard to discover where they were. You would find very few signs of them. So they had a kind of invisibility that was their own achievement. And it was an achievement. It is an achievement of hunter-gatherers. In some ways, I would say it's their greatest achievement, their invisibility. The fact that they travel so light. They need to move easily. They don't want to be cluttered up with pots and pans that are heavy with all kinds of stuff they need to cart around. There are wonderful stories in the literature of missionaries arriving at hunter-gatherer communities and describing how they gave them beautiful gifts, a sewing machine that they could work, large pots that they could cook the whole family's food in, and everybody saying, "Thank you very, very much," and then when they moved on a few days later, leaving the whole lot behind, and the missionaries protesting in dismay, and more than dismay, that their generosity was somehow not recognized. These people couldn't even understand that they needed a sewing machine. They didn't take it with them. Their lack of things, their lack of bulk, their lack of burden is their achievement, because their genius is what they know. Their most powerful and effective and complex tool is their mind, their knowledge. They know the land, and it is through their knowledge that they harvest it so successfully for so many generations. So their genius is connected to their invisibility. And there's another way still that they were invisible, and it's more elusive for me to describe this. It was a way in which they disappeared themselves when they encountered white people. I watched this over and over again in the couple of years that I was living up there. We'd meet ranchers when we were traveling on the land and go and visit them in their houses and have tea with them. We'd go drinking in Fort St. John in the bars, and we'd meet the other guys who were drinking, meet people in the town. And the white people would always be hailed and well met, cheerful and conversational and outgoing, and would make often rather unkind remarks like, "Hey, you don't go on your land anymore, do you? You don't bother hunting moose anymore, do you?" And the Dane-zaa that I was with would smile and agree and say, "Yes, yeah. And never would confront these ridiculous things that were being said to them, to my frustration. But this is another way in which, of course, they're choosing to disappear themselves. This is the sociopsychological disappearance, the disappearance of self in the encounter with these powerful strangers, these difficult and powerful strangers. So here was another sort of invisibility. Even when white people had the chance to get to know the Dane-zaa chose not to be known. And of course, almost no one ever followed them into their lands and into their territories. In the mid-1970s, it was believed, it never became likely. I was going to say it became likely. I don't think it had become likely. It was believed that an energy corridor would be built down the Alaska Highway, that oil and gas from the Alaska North Slope would be piped to the US Midwest down the Alaska Highway. Many people said this was the natural route. Here was a highway already being built during the Second World War to defend North America against the supposed Japanese invasion from the Northwest. Here was a highway all the way across this territory. So why not use that to run a pipeline down from Alaska to the US? And it looked as though that pipeline was going to go smash through the middle of the Dane-zaa lands. And the UBC-IC, the UniBC Indian chiefs, under the leadership of the great George Manuel, said, as people were saying at that moment in history, and in some ways were saying for the first time in Canadian history, you can't just build things without regard to the people who live there. There's got to be some reckoning with the people who live there. But George Manuel said, but no one knows who lives there, so we're going to have to find out. So the UniBC Indian chiefs set up a research project, and I came to coordinate this project, which was in effect to break the invisibility of the Dane-zaa. The tricky thing to do. They had chosen to be invisible for generations. Invisibility was their whole habit of culture, their habit of mind. And now the decision somehow had been taken that everyone had to know who they were and where they were. If you didn't know who they were and where they were, no one could look at and mitigate the potential impacts of this huge industrial development. And so, working with the chiefs and elders of the communities, George agreed that there should be what was called in those days the Land Use and Occupancy Project. This was something that had been done in the high Arctic in the 1970s. It was work that Canada had pioneered, in effect, the thing that came to be called cultural mapping. The idea that you could go to people, put a map of their land in front of them and say, show us on your map your life. And so they would draw the places they hunted. They would indicate the areas where they fished. They would show you where they collected birds' eggs. They would show you where they picked berries. They would show you where their trails were and their burial sites were and their stories were centered, and they'd show you the travels, the journeys they'd made across and beyond their lands. And all this could be put onto pieces of paper and could be put on a wall, and lawyers and government officials and social scientists and everybody could look at it, and no one could say, these people don't exist. No one could say these people don't have an economy. No one could say there is no impact of this pipeline because these people have long since abandoned their own resources. This was the evidence in opposition to the dispossession, and it was the evidence on the basis of which mitigation could be designed. So it was, the George Manual said, we have to have a land use and occupancy project with the Dane-zaa and the Cree of northeast British Columbia. And so I went up there with others and with members of the communities and made maps. And they made maps to show where they hunted. They made maps to show where they fished. And they created a picture of their hunting territories. And those of you who are familiar with the book Maps and Dreams, you know those maps are in there. And one particularly remarkable map is in there, which is the aggregate of all their hunting territories, which shows that if you put alongside one another the total area that the Halfway Reserve people hunted, and the Blueberry people hunted, and the Doy people hunted, and the Fort Nelson people hunted, and the Mobley Lake people hunted, if you put them all alongside one another, the entire Northeast is filled up with the hunting territories of the First Nations. Every part of it. This was an extraordinary finding, really, and it's a very beautiful finding graphically. And it did put people on the map in a way, and it meant they could negotiate their right to their resources. Though in the end, as we know, the Alaska Highway Pipeline was not or has not yet been built, but everything else has happened there except that. And if you lay a map now of the oil and gas activity on top of the hunting territories that we created between 1978 and 81, you can see that the entire area, every single one of those hunting territories, especially for the Fort St. John area bands, is dotted with activity and development sites, salt and pepper. And I was made to think about that as I looked at the remarkable work in the wonderful exhibition of the person who had shot at a map or a diagram to show development in the Northeast, and there's the bullet holes through the map, the fury expressed towards that. So we made these maps. But we also discovered in the course of this work that there was another kind of invisibility. In some ways, perhaps the most compelling and most fascinating kind to an anthropologist. And that was to do with dreaming. That hunters in northeast BC know their land in extraordinary detail. Their knowledge is extremely practical, and their decision-making includes all kinds of assembling of information, the gathering of data, the rational deductions from the data. This is the rational, empirical mind at work. The hunter brings to bear that part of human intelligence to a very high degree. In order to decide where you're going to hunt, you have to know an enormous amount of stuff. You have to know about animals and the land, and you have to know about cycles of animals, and you have to know where other people have hunted in previous years and in previous months and in the previous days, and then you have to walk out on the land yourself and look at it and read the tracks on the ground, and all that is a further set of information. This is all data. But this data isn't all you need. You need something else, something that is crucial perhaps to all really important decision-making. You need to reach into your unconscious. You need intuition. Where does that come from? Well, for the Dane-zaa, it comes from dreaming. Hunters at night would lie themselves in their appropriate position in their tents, and their spirits would travel out of their bodies in the night and go onto the land and find the animals. They would dream the hunt. And in their dream and in their dreamed hunt, they would see an animal, get to know it in the dream. They'd see the trail to the animal, get to know the trail to it, and then they would understand that the animal, by appearing in the dream, had agreed to be killed. So the relationship between them and the animal is affirmed and used in the dream. The dream is an animal encountering, a prey encountering dream for the hunter, and for the animal it's a hunter encountering experience. They encounter each other, they agree that the animal will give its life. That's the dream. The next day, or some days later, the hunter then sets out on the trail, expecting to find the trail of the dream, expecting to find the animal that they saw in the dream, and they will harvest it. This was the dream component in the hunt. This was the way in which the unconscious, the intuitive, fed into the decision-making process. It was one thing to have all the data, but you need that other magical element, the unconscious, the intuitive. And there it was as an institution in the society. We all know that if we have to make a huge decision about a heartland of our lives, it's impossible to make a list of the pros and cons. You can't make a list of the reasons for staying with her and the reasons for not staying with her. You make that list, that doesn't work. You have to find something else. You have to find something that's much stranger than making lists. And it's that piece, that strange piece, that piece that is to do with the springing forth of the unconscious that is set out in the institution of the dreaming for the Dane-zaa. And I subsequently discovered that many, many hunting peoples have some version of this. Many hunting peoples in northern Canada and around the world have some form of dreaming as a component of hunting. But this, the dream element, is very, very concealed and part of the invisibility of the decision-making, and it's linked to one other and last piece of invisibility I want to talk about, and that is the absence of bosses. When the Dane-zaa make decisions, they do not turn to the established authority. These are societies, and theirs is a society without established hierarchy. There are no people born to rule over them. Nobody's instituted to a position, nobody's given a position institutionally, which means that they have the right to make decisions for other people. There are experts, of course. One person is an expert on moose hunting, another is an expert on trapping rabbits, another is an expert on finding fish. And if you want to go moose hunting or trapping rabbits or finding fish, you will consult that expert because you know they know a lot about it. And you might well follow that person when they set off on their hunting or fishing expedition. But you have to make the decision yourself. Each person has to make their decision for themselves. And this is a society of remarkable egalitarianism. The absence of hierarchy is linked to all kinds of sharing. Everybody makes sure that everyone has the same amount of food in their homes. And it's another amazing achievement of these societies, is that they all occupy the same material place. Nobody has more in the Dane-zaa world than anybody else. And if you're a very successful hunter, then you take pride in sharing it all out to make sure everyone else eats as much as you do. But you know they're eating the moose you killed, so you can take pride, but you don't take privilege, you don't take status. This is all to do with the importance of knowledge. I mentioned earlier that the genius of the hunter-gatherer, the remarkable achievement of the Dane-zaa, is that they know the world. It is their knowledge that makes their system work. This knowledge means that they don't want the world to change. The environment has to stay stable. You need to be able to predict where you're going to go. And when we went out on the land on hunting trips, I was struck again and again about the way the Dane-zaa hunters would be checking to make sure things were as they ought to be, and noting any change. A beaver dam had appeared, a beaver dam had extended, the lake had got bigger behind the dam. Significant change. A tree had fallen down somewhere, there'd been a fire, other significant changes. They would register the changes because they needed it to be predictable. In a knowledge economy, in an economy and a society that depends on knowing the world has to remain the same. So their commitment is to a kind of environmental conservatism, which is the very opposite, of course, of the agricultural tradition. Farmers take the land and transform it. They drain the swamps and cut down the trees to make fields. If a place is rocky, they get rid of the rocks to make the fields in which they can grow the crops. And then they have to get rid of the things they don't want. Weeds, vermin, fantastically interesting words. No such word. There's no word in the Dane-zaa, or indeed the Inuit language, for a weed or vermin. They're missing categories. A weed is a plant that nobody wants. Vermin is an animal and people don't want to see. There's no such thing as a plant that nobody wants. There's no such thing as an animal nobody wants to see. But in the farmer's world, you make a field and then you've got to get rid of the things you don't want. And you have to defeat them and drive them out. You have to be in control because you have transformed the environment. It's the exact opposite of what the Dane-zaa do, what hunting people do. They have to keep it the same. The agricultural tradition has to transform it. And then you have to defend it. If you create this beautiful farm, this beautiful field, this beautiful agricultural society, you have to defend it against other people who want to get your land off you. So the development of elaborate institutions, of warfare and hierarchy are also linked in complex ways to the agricultural process, and on the whole, absent from the Dane-zaa process. So, in the Dane-zaa world, we have the mind at work, knowing and finding access to knowledge, to reality. We have a mind that takes the practical and works with it with extraordinary skill, with great dexterity, with remarkably sophisticated, if rather simple-looking tools. And you have dreams, finding another form of truth which can be fed into this. That's a description of the Dane-zaa mind. I think it's also the description of the artist's mind. The taking of an idea, working on it with your hands, bringing to bear the practicalities of your technical skills with an idea, a concept you're developing, and behind it all, or perhaps in front of it all, some sort of dream, some sort of access to the unconscious. When we made the maps in northeast BC, we realized that the job we had on hand was to make the invisible visible. And I think that's what great art does too. It makes the invisible visible. As the exhibition downstairs I was looking at before coming here so remarkably does too. It alludes to what we don't know and allows us to know it. It takes what is in the mind and puts it on the wall. And it takes out of the unconscious things that can then be put into the conscious and put out there for others to look at. In that way, I think art and hunter-gatherers know each other well at the deepest level. And maybe, if you're really lucky as an anthropologist, you can get to know both of them too. So that's all I've got to say. So some questions would be great.
So do we have questions?
Or comments or thoughts and complaints.
Comments and thoughts. So yeah, I'm going to point to you. Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to keep this mic.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It's very good to see you again and to hear your voice. Have you been able to go back to Fort St. John, to the bars, and to hang out and to see the next generation of Dane-zaa and how their lives are intersecting with the oil and gas world that is so vast now?
No, I haven't. I haven't been up there for a long time. I was last up there in the 80s, in fact. I have been in touch with people from there, and I've heard and written a bit, in fact, about what's happened since I was there. But the last 2 decades, which I think are the dramatic decades of the oil and gas frontier and development of the life, I'm sure, in those bars in Fort St. John, I have not witnessed at all. Now, of course, I've heard a bit about them, but I haven't witnessed them.
Since the dawn of the oil and gas industry up in the area that you spent some time, do you have any sense of change in the types of dreams that people have up there? Has there been any difference in that you're aware of?
Change since I was there, or change at...
Well, I heard you say that you hadn't been back in quite some time, but I'm just wondering if you have a sense in speaking with people that have the types of dreams that the hunters have they altered in any way?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm wary of saying it. I mean, it's all again and again, the stereotype has been brought to bear. You know, these are people who've had it and are doomed and driven off. I don't know. I just don't know. I know that people are very unhappy about what's going on. I know that there's deep anxieties about Site C. I know there's huge anxieties about fracking. I guess that a lot of these anxieties, are driven by the wish to maintain the hunting and trapping and gathering in their territories. That the stress that I've heard about has come from that collision. So I suppose there are families who are going out there onto the land and having to deal with the consequences of ever greater levels and ever more levels of development. And I do know, of course, about some of the terrifying statistics about what's happening in families and households, young people.
Get Kate to answer or ask the next question, because she also has some information about the dreamers. I was just wondering, because I do know that, I think within Brian Youngin's community, the last of the dreamers have basically died. And there is a new generation who Brian is considered one of them, but a dreamer in a very different way. So that it's really transformed in the last 4 decades. So.
Hi, Hugh. I don't think I can answer that question either. I know from talking to people at Doig River and in that area that dreamers and prophets are not, what they were before, and obviously because of the intensification of the oil and gas industry in the region, people haven't been able to live the way they did before. I do have some questions, though. I think we've heard you talk quite a lot about invisibility, and actually invisibility as a kind of strategy for maintaining a life way. But I wonder now what you think about the need to be more visible and people's very specific actions to increase their visibility because of the need for consultation, meaningful negotiation, meaningful engagement with industry, and so on, and other media-based or art-based or creative approaches to being highly present. I saw on Canada Day that Doig River First Nation won first prize in the Canada Day parade for their float, which was a big beaver den on top of a wood chipper with elders and drummers and young people and everybody participating. So there's been a real shift away from a kind of retreat and invisibility towards something
I think
else.
even in the time I was working there, 78, 81, that change was taking place. The younger people were appearing, younger men and women were appearing who wanted to be visible, who wanted to take their seat at the table. And certainly at the hearings into the proposed Alaska Highway Pipeline, the kind of the formal hearings that took place, I think they were led by a man called Mayer. At those hearings, people got up and spoke in a way which I think they hadn't before. They were not interested in invisibility, they were interested in being known to be there because they wanted to oppose the developments that they feared were coming. Similarly, at the Site C hearings, there were Site C hearings in 1979, I think they were, in Fort St. John, where I gave evidence at the Site C hearings in 1979, and then there were articulate young people and not so young people from East Moberly, for example, who had lots to say and wanted to be heard and to be seen. And I know that that was the beginning of a trend that's continued, and I think in a way, as the exhibition shows, that there are new forms of communication that are all to do with being visible, indeed making your invisibility visible, and the meaning of it understood. And I think one of the most remarkable things in the exhibition here is the Askoty photographs. Just extraordinary. I remember going to visit that family, and we spent a lot of time with them, and they were really at the core of the Dane-zaa culture and mindset. This was a family completely dependent on hunting and trapping. No idea about this. These photographs are being generated, and they're an amazing glimpse of that world. And they're haunting and disturbing, but they're there, out there for us to see. And I think that is a very significant shift, and I'm sure it's part of huge change that's taken place. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm an art historian. And research I did in the 70s and 80s, resulting in books or articles, exhibitions, continued on in fits and starts through to the present time, which took me back to the sites of my crimes and my research. And so I'm, at the risk of sounding impertinent, I'm deeply puzzled why you haven't been back since the 80s. I mean, really puzzled, because it's obviously been such a major part of your dreaming and your imaginative structure that not to go is to insist on a kind of invisibility yourself, it seems to me.
I'm puzzled too. I think it's and that I am hoping to get back soon. A number of things happened that made it difficult for me. That the family that I was closest to had 3 central male hunters and then 3 women in there. So 6 people in the house, 3 men and 3 women. And one of those was the elder who kind of took me on as his, in the way you have to be taken on and to be welcomed and provided with things and given a horse and a saddle and all things that I needed to have came from him. And he died right at the end of the time I was there. And he was old, and it wasn't a tragedy, it was very sad. But then, not long after I left, his brothers-in-law, who were much, much younger than him, in fact, were both murdered, one extremely brutally, by white people in Fort St. John. He went into Fort St. John to go shopping, and the evidence seems to show that 2 young white men saw him wandering around in Fort St. John and offered him a lift and put him on the back of their pickup. They drove him on the back of the pickup to a bridge over the Peace River. They took him out and threw him in the river. This story emerged because one of them confessed. Felt so awful about it, he confessed, and there was a trial at which that was the evidence he gave. No reason for not believing him. That was a colossal shock. That happened about 5 or 6 years after I left. And then I also heard that his brother, his older brother, whom I spent a lot of time hunting with, also been murdered within the community in some terrible drunken episode which nobody seems to understand. But I think those deaths were a huge shock to me, and And maybe it was kind of a cowardice on my part. I was working on lots of other projects that gave me a reason for not going there, but I think there was part of me that was frightened of going back. I think I was frightened of the changes. I didn't know who I'd go back to quite. That family was in a way gone. The men whom I always spent my time with was slightly difficult. The male-female thing was a big issue there. Difficult for me to spend time with the women a lot easily, but with the men, those were the men I knew, those were the men I traveled with, men who taught me. Now, there were many other people I knew, but they were the core, and so that's a part of the explanation. But I don't think it's a complete explanation. It's something else to do with, I think, a certain apprehension of encountering all sorts of difficulties that I wouldn't be able to cope with, maybe.
May I ask if it's a working methodology of yours to return in general to places that you have worked closely with people, or if this is, in fact, a larger pattern?
No, I think the pattern in my life is the opposite. I think I've gone back to some places a bit for over a 10-year period, but then not to move on. The anthropological betrayal.
Your work as a writer and your own dreams and unconscious. I wonder if you have any stories or comments or insights about how in your writing dreams and unconscious may have played a part.
No, great question. Well, a lot. Not directly dreams. I mean, I'm not someone whose dreams drive the work. But I often wake up very early in the morning knowing something that I need to know. Often with thoughts that I need to write down quickly. And if I'm writing well, my pattern is to get up very early in the morning and capture those thoughts while I can. I think that's true of many people who write. And I think that is closely related to the dreaming. And a couple of times, or several times in my life, I've had very, very difficult intellectual puzzles I just cannot, I seem to be unable to sort out. And that I wake up with the answers. Sometimes very early, sometimes 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 5 or 6, and I wake up with the answer. That's somewhere it gets disentangled in the dream space. So I'm very familiar with that and rely on it a lot. Yeah. Mm.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. I had 2 questions. The first is if you could speak a little bit to the limitations of maps, particularly Western cartographic maps seem very inadequate in kind of conveying the complexity of Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous cultures. And then tied into that, I was wondering if you could speak to the ethics of mapping and how certain Indigenous knowledges should remain invisible, at least to like the greater society, and especially settler society. So I was wondering if you could speak to those ideas.
Well, it is remarkable what happens in a cultural mapping project if you begin with topographical sheets. Maybe you've had experience, maybe you worked on these kind of projects. You lay down a topographical sheet. I remember doing this for the first time in the Arctic in 1975, I think it's 76, laying down a topographical sheet in front of Inuit hunters, and on the sheet it says things like Prince William Sound, Prince Regent Inlet. You know, these are huge areas with these grand British names, Lancaster Sound, Bylot Island. You know, these are the North Baffin's geography. Thousands of square miles, one name across it, claimed and owned and mapped by the colonial powers. And then see the Inuit cover this with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of details from their minds and their place names. Their place names, on and on and on and on and on and on. I made a place name map for just the community where I lived, which the whole thing is crowded with names. And then you start to mark places of cultural significance to them. And you get a completely different kind of map. A completely different kind of map. Now, there's no reason why that map can't go into a book of maps. And in fact, there are some such books. I know the Giksan Wet'suwet'en Tribal Council produced its book of maps. It's an completely whole other way of knowing northwest British Columbia. The Stalo Atlas up the Fraser Valley. It's another book which has another way of representing the world cartographically. So I think it's perfectly possible to create an atlas that is true to the people's view and knowledge. Whether it could ever be complete, I doubt. It's not possible. It can't be complete. So, for example, in the North Baffin area, we did ecological maps. We decided we should represent how people understood the animal populations. So we did the movement of ice, where the ice tended to form in the middle of the winter, where the big cracks appeared in the ice, and how the movements of the narwhales and the walruses and the killer whales related to these cracks and breaks in the ice, and what was following what, and how this all worked. You could make a map showing this. It's possible, but you can't. It's so sophisticated, the knowledge is so detailed, that I don't know how it would defy ordinary cartography. So I suppose you can capture the surface of an indigenous culture in maps, but you would never be able to capture the full knowledge. And then the ethics of map making, this arose in northeast BC when I was working there. The Dane-zaa I was working with did not want parts of their territory referred to or reported. So in Maps and Dreams, I create fictitious names for places. People said they don't want their real places to be known because if white people, they had this idea. Now, they didn't read, people I worked with, they didn't read. They read the tracts. They were extremely literate when it came to the environment. They didn't read books. But they had this idea that if I wrote down where they went hunting, white people would read this, and they'd all come there and hunt there because these are the best places in the world for hunting in their mind. So they didn't want that to be known. So there was an ethics, I suppose, that was brought to bear. And I've often everyone who works on cultural mapping anguishes over that. And also communities are not of one mind. I speak as though the community is all of one mind. I mean, one person might say, oh, I want this to be shown. Another person might be not at all sure about it. That's very tricky, very tricky. And certainly in the case of court cases, I suppose Giksan Wet'suwet'en is the most striking example. In the Delgamuukw case, they presented their entire cartographic achievement to the court, to the world, to win that, in the end, to win that judgment in the Supreme Court. But along the way, elders had to stand up and give evidence, were humiliated in the court, were ridiculed, felt terrible. It was awful to see. I remember sitting in agony in Delgamuukw, and also in the Absassin case, sitting watching elders giving evidence, thinking, this is torture for them, being cross-examined, accused of misrepresenting things, People who always seek to speak the truth in their terms, accused by cross-examining lawyers of misrepresenting. It's awful. So I think it is ethically problematic. And if you go to court, especially, it raises very, very interesting questions, difficult questions to resolve for communities. I suspect you know more about this than I do, but those are some thoughts.
Lindsay, you had a question? No? Okay.
How is it that people who walk through the land and over the land can understand what it looks like from a map?
Extraordinary. This is one of the most remarkable things. The great filmmaker, Robert Flaherty, made Nanook of the North and Man of Aaron, the father of documentary film, perhaps of film in some ways, travelled in 1909 with an Inuit guide called Witaltuk across the Ungava Peninsula. He was looking for iron ore, Flaherty was looking for iron ore, and Witaltuk was his Inuk guide. And Witaltuk was a completely traditional person from the Arctic Bay coast, South Hudson's Bay coast. Along the way, Witaltuk told Flaherty that he lived on some islands offshore, that were not on white people's maps. Somehow or other, he managed to communicate this to Flaherty, and Flaherty asked Witalthuk to draw a picture of his islands, thinking they were I think he initially thought there's some kind of mythic construct. So it was like a dream map. And Witalthuk drew this unbelievably complicated map showing a set of islands. And Flaherty asked him how big was the biggest of these islands, north to south. And Witalthuk said it would take 3 days by dog team in good weather. So that meant it would be about 100 miles. So Flaherty thought, if you take Witalthuk's map, which you can find online, I looked for Witalthuk's map, Flaherty's map, and look at it alongside a modern cartographic representation of those islands, it's miraculous. He's got it exactly right. I mean, he's got the proportions right, he's got the islands right, he's got the little bays right, he's got the width of this against the length of that just right. They're exactly 100, they're about 90 odd miles long. And Witalthuk revealed, I think this is the first example of an indigenous map that was done with care to show a homeland, to show exactly where this person lived. And it revealed that Witalthuk could see it from above. But how he could see it from above, I don't know. And certainly when I was mapping in the Arctic, the Inuit maps, every Inuit hunter that we worked with had no difficulty at all locating themselves on maps, making maps, as if they could see the world from above. Similarly, the Dane-zaa, when doing their maps, I don't know. Perhaps it's the shaman flight. Perhaps they travel through the sky. But they are birds. They are birds in some other incarnation. The shamanic idea that you fly and see the world from above, I don't know. It is a deep mystery, but they can do it.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us here today, and I'd also like to encourage you to go back to those places and to share the knowledge that you received from those men that have passed since with the next generation, just because it's incredibly painful that their knowledge was lost, but also that that you feel disassociated from that space now. But you have had the amazing privilege of receiving that time with them, and possibly that some knowledges which weren't able to be passed on. And thank you again for speaking today.
Thank you very much. I should have said that when we did the maps, people never wanted to be alone doing the maps. They always wanted the family to gather round. And doing the maps was also passing on the knowledge to the younger people who were there, often to the children and grandchildren. So it was not just passing it to me, it was passing it out into the community. The map making was transmission of knowledge out. And it was very much what people wanted to do with them. It was a great privilege to be there, though.
Lindsay, and then Kate.
Thank you for your talk. And I have a question that might be a little bit naive, but I'm just wondering if it's a bit of a false dichotomy to talk about, continuity versus change or versus cultural loss. It strikes me, having lived in various places in the world, that people often talk about generational change or, entering modernity. Or, for example, when I was living in a very small Greek village, everybody said, everybody's listening to Michael Jackson, everything's changed. And to me, those kids were so extremely Greek, but from one perspective, people talked about them as if they were, that everybody's Americanized now. And I just was wondering if you could maybe talk about, and I'm very close friends with a Dane-zaa person who lives in a city and is urbanized supposedly, and yet I see what you're many of the traits that you're talking about. So and he's probably going to watch this video and kill me for having asked this question and said that, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about continuity. with
loss.
change,
Yeah.
because a lot of the things that you're talking about don't seem that lost to me, but you'd have to sort of change the way you frame your thinking about it in order to see those things as still existing. So.
Yeah, my experience of the Dane-zaa very much was that they sought continuity in defiance of the pressures, and sometimes alongside the pressures. So the people I worked with were not completely traditional and isolated. They used a rather broken down old gun, a steel axe, steel traps, mostly, not only, but steel traps, wire for snares, as you saw in the film, metal for good knives, matches. They wore clothes that they could buy from the Hudson's Bay store or some other trader. So they had encountered the newcomers and taken things that were useful to them in order to pursue their mode of life. And that, I think, remains a pattern. They take pickup trucks and rifles with telescopic sights and go out into their lands to pursue their mode of life. The crisis may arise if they can't pursue their mode of life at all anymore for objective reasons, or there may be a crisis that comes from young people not wanting to do it at all, a sort of breakdown of heritage. But I've never encountered the latter. Former, of course, is part of reality in many places. So I think continuity is part of the story always. I'm very glad you asked that question, because I wouldn't want people to think that they've got a way of doing things, they stick to it. Not at all. They're always looking for what's going to be useful in the new stuff. And yeah. Yeah, that's a big factor.
And I wonder also if technology has something to do with this, like seeing in the film clip, the radio and the message board. And Lindsay and I both know that was incredibly influential to Brian, Brian Young, and thinking about possibly he proposed a work that would use the radio kind of call-in message board. And now that wouldn't function the same way because of cell phones, and you don't have that community built around it. So there is a kind of implicit change via technology that's unavoidable. Anyway.
Yes, actually, the message form is a very interesting example of technological change that people really welcomed. They really liked the message system from Forward to John, and they often depended upon it. Yeah.
Kate?
Thanks. Well, speaking of message time, I actually got a Facebook message just this morning from someone from Doing River saying, Kate, can someone record Hugh's talk, because we'd like to see it, and also we'd like to talk, like to get in touch. So via Facebook, the new message time, someone's looking for you. So, but I did want to ask you a little bit about voice in Maps and Dreams, because I've been rereading it in advance of the reading group coming up, and one of the things that struck me, I think you say something like the irony of making maps is that by trying to make something visible, you of course render other things invisible in the course of making the map. And I wonder about that process in writing books too, in texts.
What's made invisible along the way?
Yes, and so I guess the question I want to ask is. The structure of Maps and Dreams was quite revolutionary. I think it really struck people, certainly me and many other people, because of the way you acknowledged and played with voice in the text, and the way that you told the stories of your interactions with people and the things that you learned. I just wonder if you think about writing or anthropology today, how you might, if anything, write that book differently today. Would you do it the same way, or would you think about voice differently, given that some decades have passed?
Well, I think I've become more and more persuaded of the importance of the personal, rather than less persuaded of its importance. But I do think you need two different kinds of discourse in anthropology, probably in all social science, and how you handle the relationship between those two is a matter, I guess, of authorship, different forms of writing. But I remember realizing that the secret of writing Maps and Dreams I struggled with it. I wrote the whole thing once without that division, and I wasn't happy with it, and I suddenly realized that the division was the way to do it, alternating chapters was the way to do it. And I think probably I still think that in my own understanding of what I'm doing, that that's the way to do it. That sometimes I'm doing one thing and sometimes I'm doing another. Sometimes I'm being the social scientist and sometimes I'm being myself. And I think the truth is it's hard to keep these apart, but it may be useful to try to do so. And if there's a trend in my life, it's towards looking more and more at what's in the personal, what's concealed in the personal. As to what's hidden, what's concealed by the maps, do you know, I'm not sure I remember what I meant, but it might have been that in those maps are very approximate creatures, and they show the outer boundary of a territory. There it is. This is our hunting territory. There it is. That's where we fish. But the precision of the decision-making, the site specificity within that is missing. Maybe that's what I mean.
Thank you.
There's a question here.
It's been a while since I've read your book, but it was hugely influential on me in university. And one of the things that I was really struck by was the complexity of the communication between the indigenous people and the consultants who came in from outside. So they would come in and have a 3-day consultation. People would tell their stories, and they were just starting to tell their stories. And then, the scientists and everyone would just pack up and go. And so what some people interpreted as the beginning of sort of establishing a relationship or telling a story was really just, well, you haven't answered any of these questions, so we're just going to disregard what you said and move on. Yeah. And I think that has so informed my understanding of really the challenges that we face, is that sometimes we're speaking differently, we're speaking different languages, but also with different objectives. Some objectives are relationship-based and other objectives are very goal-oriented. So I'm just wondering if, what's the way forward with that, I guess, maybe is my question. Fix it.
Well, I think you're great, you're absolutely right. And that's the huge misunderstanding that often takes place at the hearing or the interview. Well, the answer is time, isn't it? The relationship and time. The episode I think you're referring to is the Alaska Highway Pipeline hearing, when they actually wanted to bring out the dream map. Finally, the meeting had gone on and had reached its end, and I think they had misunderstood. I think, as I remember, the chairman of the meeting declared the meeting was over. The people didn't understand that he declared it was over, but they thought this was the point at which it was really about to begin. So they brought out their dream map, which is the most important moment. This is the most important moment, but by that time it was over. So it was a fantastic metaphor, really, for the way they miss each other. And but the guy there was full of goodwill. I mean, if someone had come to him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, Chairman, I think you should stay another 24 hours, he might have had difficulty. But if he said, you need to stay another 3 or 4 hours, it would have been all right. But no, the misunderstanding is so profound that it's really hard to deal with unless you commit to just staying and staying. And then it's not just staying, it's also staying in the right, in a certain kind of relationship. Listening is the big challenge.
Perhaps that is the end note. Listening is the big challenge. So thank you very much, Hugh.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.